My name is Ethan Cole, and I've been a firefighter for 15 years. 15 years of running headfirst into the kind of hell most people would give anything to escape. 15 years of smoke in my lungs, ash in my hair, and the weight of lives I couldn't save pressing down on my chest like a vice. Some nights, when I close my eyes, I can still hear their screams. People like to call us heroes. They don't see the way we sit in our trucks after a call, staring at the ground, our hands shaking. They don't feel the terror that creeps in when you realize you might not make it out this time. But you keep going, because that's what we do. The Topanga Ridge Fire of 2025 was different. It wasn't the biggest fire I'd fought, but it was the one that changed me, the one that took something I can never get back. And now, as I sit here outside the shelter, watching the last wisps of smoke rise from what used to be homes, I wonder if we ever really win. I want to tell you what happened that night, not for pity, not for praise, just because some things need to be said. The call came in late afternoon, just as the sun dipped behind the hills, painting the sky in a deep, blood orange glow. I was sitting in the firehouse, my coffee cold in my hands, when the radio crackled to life. Wildfire encroaching on Topanga Ridge, structures threatened, immediate deployment. I didn't even flinch. Calls like that were routine by now. We'd been waiting for it, watching the humidity drop, the winds pick up. The Santa Anas, those cursed devil winds, were pushing the fire like it had a vendetta. We were out the door in minutes, sirens screaming into the thickening smoke, the air already heavy with the promise of something terrible. By the time we reached the ridge, it was a war zone. The fire wasn't just spreading, it was consuming. Whole houses were swallowed in seconds, the flames so high they reached the sky, turning everything into a sick parody of daylight. Families were running, piling into cars with whatever they could grab, dogs barking, kids crying, the elderly moving too slow. I saw a man just standing there, frozen, watching his home burn like he couldn't believe it was happening. I wanted to tell him to move, to run, but I couldn't. We had work to do. The heat hit us like a freight train. Even through our turnout gear, it seared into our skin, making every breath feel like we were swallowing embers. I gripped my radio tighter, scanning the chaos. Where do they need us? The reply was almost drowned out by the roar of the fire. We've got reports of people trapped in a nursing home at the end of the canyon, no way in by road. I glanced at my lieutenant, Mike Ramirez. We didn't need to say anything. We knew what we had to do. We're going in. We pushed through the thick smoke, the flames dancing like living things on either side of us. Ash rained down, coating everything in a fine layer of gray that felt like death itself. My heart was pounding, but my hands were steady. I couldn't think about the danger. I couldn't think about what would happen if the fire closed in too fast. We made it to the nursing home in what felt like hours, but had probably been minutes. The place was an eerie kind of quiet, the only sound the distant crackling of fire. I could feel the fear thick in the air, heavier than the smoke. Inside, it was chaos. Elderly residents sat in their chairs, too scared or too weak to move. Some were crying, others just staring, their eyes wide and empty. Caretakers were shouting, trying to keep everyone calm, but their own fear was seeping through. I knelt beside an old woman, gripping a picture frame so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Ma'am, we need to get you out of here." She shook her head, tears streaking her face. "I can't leave him behind." She held up the photo, a smiling man in uniform, long gone from this world, but still holding her heart. My throat tightened. There was no time for this, no time for anything. But I knelt beside her anyway. "We'll bring it with us, all right? But we have to go." She nodded slowly, and I lifted her gently, carrying her out into the smoke. Each step felt like walking through molasses, the heat pressing in from all sides. I could hear the fire creeping closer, feel the way the air thickened with the promise of disaster. Then it happened. A loud crack and the ceiling groaned. Mike was behind me, guiding another resident when the roof above him gave way. I turned just in time to see it, flames licking at the wood, the beams snapping like a toothpick, and then he was gone. "Mike!" I lunged forward, but the fire had already swallowed him. My hands trembled, my vision blurred from the heat and something else, something worse. He was trapped. I could hear him shouting, his voice straining above the fire. "Ethan, get them out! That's an order!" I hesitated, just for a second that stretched into eternity. the fire was closing in. The old woman in my arms coughed weakly, and I knew I had no choice. "I'll come back for you," I screamed, hoping he could hear me. I didn't believe it, neither did he. I ran because I had to, because that's the job. We made it outside just as the building collapsed behind us, sending a wave of fire and smoke into the sky. I stood there, gasping for air, watching the place where Mike had been. There was nothing left. I stood there, staring at the nursing home as it crumbled into the fire, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might tear through my chest. The old woman in my arms clung to me, coughing weakly, but all I could hear was the sound of Mike's voice echoing in my head. "Get them out! That's an order!" I should have fought harder. I should have done more. But instead, I ran. I left him in there. And the weight of it hit me like a freight train, but I didn't have time to fall apart. My team swarmed around me, taking the woman from my arms, their voices distant and muffled through the roar of the fire. Someone slapped my shoulder. "We need to move, Ethan. The fire's jumping the ridge." I blinked, swallowing hard, forcing my legs to move, one step, then another. We pushed forward, dragging hoses, spraying down the flames that kept chasing us, as if the fire itself was mocking me, taunting me with every burning ember. I was on autopilot, my mind stuck inside that building, reliving the moment over and over again. The way the ceiling had groaned, the look in Mike's eyes, the way his voice cracked when he told me to leave him. I could still hear him in my head, screaming for me to go, but I couldn't shake the thought, what if I had just one more second? Could I have pulled him out? Could I have saved him? I should have stayed. I should have died in there with him. The fire didn't care about my guilt. It kept coming, faster, hotter, more relentless than anything I'd ever faced. Every breath felt like swallowing broken glass, my lungs raw from the heat and smoke. The ash clung to my skin, turning my sweat into thick streaks of mud that ran down my face. Somewhere in the distance, I heard the gut-wrenching wail of a trapped animal. A dog, maybe. The sound cut through me like a blade. I didn't even realize I was moving until Torres grabbed my arm. "Ethan, where the hell are you going?" I shrugged him off. There's someone, still out there. I didn't wait for an answer. I couldn't. I ran toward the sound, deeper into the blackened remains of a neighborhood that once had life, color, laughter. Now it was just shadows and silhouettes, melted cars and scorched earth. My boots crunched over broken glass and charred wood as I moved, scanning the wreckage. And then I saw it. A dog, huddled under the remains of a collapsed porch, its fur singed and its eyes wide with fear. It whimpered as I knelt down, my hands shaking as I reached for it. "Hey, buddy, I got you," I whispered, my voice thick with smoke and something else, something I couldn't name. The dog hesitated, then pressed its trembling body against my chest. For a moment, I just held him, feeling the frantic thump of his heart against mine. He was scared. I was scared. But at least he was alive. At least I could save him. I carried him back through the smoke, back to the others, and as I handed him off to one of the paramedics, I caught sight of my reflection in the ambulance window. I looked like a ghost, blackened, hollow-eyed, like the fire had burned something out of me that I'd never get back. But there wasn't time to dwell. There never was. We worked through the night, fighting the fire with everything we had left. The flames weren't just consuming buildings anymore. They were consuming us. Every hour that passed felt like a lifetime. Every scream another weight on my shoulders. When dawn finally broke, the fire was still raging, but we'd managed to push it back enough to hold the line. I dropped to my knees in the dirt, my body screaming in exhaustion. And that's when it hit me. Mike was gone. The realization settled over me like a blanket soaked in ice water, numbing and suffocating all at once. I looked down at my hands, blackened, blistered, trembling. These hands had saved lives tonight, but not his. Someone crouched beside me, Torres. He didn't say anything. He just sat there, staring at the wreckage with me. And for the first time in years, I felt something crack inside me. "I left him," I whispered. The words felt like lead in my mouth, heavy and cold. "I should have..." Torres shook his head, his face streaked with soot and exhaustion. "He gave you an order, Ethan. You did what you had to do." I wanted to believe that. I really did. But all I could see was the fire swallowing him whole. Hours passed, maybe more. I lost track. They pulled bodies from the rubble, counted the saved and the lost. We were all ghosts walking through the ashes, our faces grim, our hearts heavier than ever. Eventually, I found myself standing in front of the spot where the nursing home used to be. All that was left was a pile of smoldering debris and the faint smell of something I'd rather not think about. I clenched my fists, letting the pain in my burned palms ground me. "I'll come back for you," I had told him, but I hadn't. I wondered if he knew, in those last moments, that I'd never be able to forgive myself. When I finally made it back to the station, the exhaustion hit me all at once. I sat in my locker room, staring at Mike's locker, the one he'd never open again. His nameplate was still there, the stupid stickers his kids had slapped on it still half peeling. I ran my fingers over them, my throat tight. I thought about his wife, his kids, how I was going to look them in the eye and tell them their dad wasn't coming home. I wasn't ready for that. I wasn't sure I'd ever be. The fire eventually died out. They always do, but it left scars behind that no amount of time could ever erase. Every time I put on my gear, I felt the weight of it, like Mike was still there, whispering in my ear, "Keep going, Ethan, just keep going." And so I did, because that's what we do. We keep moving, keep fighting, even when the fire isn't burning anymore. But deep down, I knew it never really stops. Not inside us, not inside me. The fire was out. The news said it was contained, like we had somehow tamed a wild animal and sent it back to where it came from. But I knew better. Fires don't just end, they linger. In the air, in the ground, and inside you. I stood in front of what used to be the nursing home, staring at the blackened debris piled high against the charred earth. The place where I left Mike behind. The official report said we saved 38 lives that night. 38 people who walked away from hell, who got to see another day. They called it a miracle. But to me, it felt like failure. I ran my hand over the soot-streaked name patch on my turnout gear. Coal. It felt heavier than ever. Torres found me there, standing in the rubble, my legs refusing to move. He didn't say anything at first, just stood beside me like he knew words wouldn't fix anything. Eventually, he let out a heavy sigh. "You can't keep doing this to yourself, man," he said. I didn't respond. I just kept staring, waiting, like if I stood there long enough, maybe the fire would give him back to me. But it didn't. It never does. I couldn't face Mike's family right away. What do you even say to a wife and kids when you're the one who came back, and he didn't? I sat in my truck outside his house for an hour, gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles went white. I could see his kids through the window, playing on the living room floor, oblivious to the fact that their world had just caved in. And his wife, God, the way she looked when she opened the door. She didn't cry, not right away. She just stared at me, and in that moment, I wanted to disappear. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I tried. She shook her head. "He wouldn't have let you stay." I swallowed hard, guilt twisting inside me like a blade. I should have done more. Her lips trembled and she touched my arm, so gently it almost broke me. "You brought others home, Ethan. That's what he would have wanted." I nodded, but the words didn't reach me. Nothing could, not when I still heard his voice in my head, telling me to go, telling me to save who I could. That night, I sat alone in my apartment, staring at the reflection of the fire still burning behind my eyes. Every time I closed them, I was back in that collapsing building, back in the smoke and the heat, back in that moment where I made the choice I'll carry for the rest of my life. Days passed in a blur of exhaustion and empty stares. The department gave us time to recover, but the truth is, we never really do. Firefighters don't get to grieve like normal people. We just get the next call. And it came sooner than I expected. A small house fire in a quiet neighborhood. Nothing compared to Topanga Ridge, just a faulty wire in an old kitchen. But when I walked through that front door, the smell of burning wood hit me like a punch to the gut. My legs locked up, my breath caught in my throat, and suddenly I was back there, back in the fire, back with Mike, back in that moment I couldn't escape. "Hey, you all right?" Torres' voice snapped me out of it, his hand firm on my shoulder. I blinked, forcing a nod. Yeah, I'm good." But I wasn't. I kept moving, kept doing the job, but every siren reminded me of the one I couldn't answer. Every crackling ember whispered his name. I thought about quitting. God knows I wanted to. But the thing is, Mike wouldn't want that. He lived for this job, and I owed it to him to keep going. So I did. A few weeks later, I got a call from the shelter we worked with during the fire. The dog I'd saved, somehow, he'd survived, just like me. They asked if I wanted to come see him. I almost said no. I didn't think I could handle it. But something made me go. Maybe I needed to see something that made it out. When I walked into the shelter, the dog's tail thumped against the floor the second he saw me. He limped over, still bandaged, still healing, and pressed his head against my leg. And for the first time since the fire, I let myself feel something other than guilt. I knelt down, ran a hand through his fur, and whispered, "We made it, buddy. We're still here." He looked up at me with those big, trusting eyes, and I realized something. I couldn't change what happened. I couldn't bring Mike back, but I could keep moving forward. For him, for the ones we saved, for the ones we couldn't. Some nights, I still wake up choking on phantom smoke, hearing the fire whisper my name. And every time I put on my gear, I wonder if today's the day I don't make it back. But I keep going, because that's what we do. Mike's voice still echoes in my head sometimes. "Keep going, Ethan. Just keep going." And I do. Thank you so much for listening to my story. If you like stories like this, please subscribe to the channel and comment down below what other stories you would like to hear.